Teamwork isn't just nice to have in business, it's the undisputed competitive advantage. When your team members work as a unified force, your whole operation benefits through higher productivity, thriving creativity, and unstoppable momentum. Welcome to the Impactful Teamwork Podcast, where we share with you strategies and tactics to help you develop game-changing teams so that you and your business can make a real difference in the world. "20%. That is the proportion of the global workforce that Gallup now describes as being engaged at work. And this is the lowest figure they have ever recorded since they began measuring. It's fallen in each of the last 3 years, and there's not a single region in the world where these engagement levels are going up. And I think this should genuinely be a concern for all of us. But there's one other number that also really stands out in their research, and that is that manager engagement has fallen from 30% to 22% in the space of just 2 years, which means that the people that organizations rely on to really keep the organization working have really quietly stopped holding it together. This is the power of middle management, because they are so crucial in everything that happens in an organization. And Gallup also acknowledged that 70% of the variance in a team's engagement is attributable to the team's direct manager. So, of course, what does that mean? That means when a manager disengages, everything downstream disengages as well. And if you try to put a cost on that, it's estimated that $10 trillion a year, or roughly 9% of global GDP, is the cost of this massive level of disengagement. But there's something that a lot of leadership teams haven't really worked out right now, and it's this fact. The fact is that everybody right now is reaching for AI as the answer. And the uncomfortable truth is, of course, is that AI does not fix your culture. In fact, it does the opposite. AI amplifies culture. And what does that mean? It means that wherever you already are, you're about to become considerably faster and get more of what you're already doing. And that, of course, might not be what you want to happen. So the question I really want to provoke in this edition of Impactful Teamwork is not whether your organization has a culture, because all organizations have a culture. It's really much more a question of whether you have designed it consciously or not. And I also want you to think about which of the 4 levels of culture you are currently operating at, and whether the thing that you're about to amplify is really worth amplifying, or are we amplifying the wrong thing? So welcome to Impactful Teamwork, and we've got a really exciting episode for you today, because this episode has been inspired by a webinar that I listened to last week by one of my mentors, Peter Matthies of the Conscious Business Institute. Now, I studied with the Conscious Business Institute a number of years ago, and I have a master's from them in helping create purpose-driven organizations, because that's something I'm really passionate about. But what was really interesting was that when Peter explained the 4 levels of culture that he's actually seeing occurring in organizations, it maps really well to the 4 culture zones that I've been talking about in business, where businesses need to move from this level of toxicity through the ranks up to becoming turbocharged. And one of the things that we talked about on this webinar was that, and that Peter has observed in his 15 years of building cultures inside of organizations, was that he's never really found a systemic approach to building culture. Not in the consultancies he's worked in, not in the literature. And I think we all know that culture in many organizations is something that gets written on the wall printed on lanyards, and then it's often abandoned to chance. And so what they've done at the Conscious Business Institute is actually they've created this model, the 4 levels of culture, that describe what an organization is fundamentally organized around. And as I said, when I sat with this model and the way that Peter so eloquently described it, I realized it mapped to what I see happening with leadership teams all the time. And particularly when they come and work with the horses, because the horses have no interest in your culture deck. They respond to what is actually going on and what the business is actually organized around. And they respond to it super fast as well. And this is why I'm so passionate about bringing teams to work with the horses, because I think it gives you such an honest diagnostic about what is really going on in your organization. So I thought it would be helpful to take you through the 4 levels that have been identified by the Conscious Business Institute. And the first level is an output culture. And this is where the overwhelming majority of organizations sit. This is a culture that is results focused, it's externally facing, and the only metric that genuinely counts is financial return. The leader in this type of culture is usually really competent, they're often impressive, and they work through that familiar sequence of judging, strategizing, delegating, and adjusting again. And this is the type of culture, nothing looks broken from the outside, but doing more is better, and more activity and more output create more throughput, which is assumed will translate to more profit and more business success. So the defining characteristic of this kind of output culture is that it's quite mechanistic rather than more systemic and organizational. It's all about process. And actually, in this type of organization, at a culture level 1, people are often seen as replaceable components. People are seen as a resource. Structure is typically hierarchical because in a mechanistic environment, you need a controller. Somebody who can direct and set everything into motion. And actually, here's the irony. This is exactly why AI fits so well into culture level 1, because they're such a great match for each other. Output culture with AI means that the machine learning is really good at producing more of the same thing. So when we drop AI into a culture whose organizing principles are already doing more, you don't get transformation. Actually, what you get is acceleration. And if you're not careful, that leads to exhaustion. Peter shared a really great example of this in his own experience, where he recently took some time off to go on a sabbatical to Mexico to really think about the strategy and where he wanted to take the Conscious Business Institute and what was next for it. And of course, he used AI, as many of us do, to help him create a strategy and a plan, a 4-week plan, an 8-week plan, a 12-month plan. And as we know, AI is great at doing this and can do this in a matter of hours. But I don't know if you're like me, I've had this experience too, where I've asked AI to do something, and actually, rather than having clarity at the end, I am just in complete overwhelm by the amount of information that's being provided to me. And I think that's because I've got a lot of output, but it doesn't have any of my level of judgment in it or any of my level of reasoning about whether what AI is creating for me really makes sense. And we see this in organizations, don't we, a lot of the time, where a leadership team implements a tool or a strategy that supposedly increases capacity by a factor of 2 or 3, and then actually finds out later on that all it's done is exhaust the team members. People are less certain about what happens, and we're no closer to the strategic outcomes we wanted than at the beginning. So there was nothing wrong with the tool per se. The problem is that they've poured it into a culture whose only organizing idea is volume. So I might like to suggest that if burnout is rising in your organization while output is also rising, you're most certainly running at a level 1 culture speed. So what is level 2 culture? What does that look like? Level 2 culture is intentional culture. And this is where purpose and judgment start to lead rather than volume. So the human contribution shifts from producing output to sense making, to setting direction, and to exercising the discernment that decides which work is worth doing at all. So AI stops being an accelerator and becomes a collaborator because there's now a human intelligence sitting above it before deciding what should be amplified. And I think that this is really important because as great as AI is, and I've been doing a lot of training in AI recently, AI is and should only ever be a collaborator for us. It always needs to have this level of human discernment above it to really sense check about whether what we're getting out makes sense or not. And what I do think about that is great about AI is it can do some really mundane jobs really well. And I just want to share an example of IKEA because they replaced 8,500 customer service representatives with AI. And at first thought, you must go, oh my goodness me, that's a huge level of people that they made redundant. But actually, ironically, what IKEA did, and I think this is incredibly smart, is that rather than making those roles redundant, they've actually retrained all of those people as interior design advisors. So they've actually helped elevate these people in the value chain to start doing work that actually requires judgment, creativity, and relationship building rather than just following a script as a customer service rep. So this is just an example of how an organization can become way more adaptive as a result of implementing AI. And this intention culture is a considerable step forward from our level 1 output culture. And I think a lot of people listening to the podcast today might actually think their organization is at a level 2 culture. But I hate to be the bearer of bad news. Actually, you're probably more likely to be at that level 1 culture. And I think the thing that tends to be missing at a level 2 culture that's worth naming, and why so many organizations feel brittle from the inside, is that trust is missing. Well-being is missing. Sustainability in the human sense of the word is missing. So whilst an intention culture is more effective and more adaptable than an output culture, it's actually at its essence still fundamentally very mechanistic. It's just a better directed machine than at level 1. Level 3 is when we move up to a human-centric culture. And this is where the real shift occurs. And it's not a shift in strategy. This is a shift in what the leadership team believes. So in a human-centric culture, we're putting our team members front and center of the business. Not alongside the numbers, but in place of them. So there is just one thing at the center, and that is our team. And there's a conscious shift that has to happen for this to hold true. And that is that the leadership team have to genuinely believe all the way up to the top that when humans are at the center, the results will follow. They absolutely have to believe that when we get the team right and everyone is pulling together in the same direction, then the results will automatically happen. And I think this is where most attempts at culture change often fall over. And the failure is typically for the same reason. What we see is that the leader announces that we are becoming human-centric, people are at the center of everything we do. But actually, the language that we continue to use is very mechanistic, is very outcome driven. And so we've got these two contradictory messages going on. And this is why the culture doesn't stick. It's not that our team members are being cynical, it's that they're actually really paying attention and realizing that there is some disconnect between what is actually being said and what is actually happening and what we want to happen. So, what genuinely really changes at a level 3 is the nature of the types of conversations we're having in the business. The questions become more about what are we experiencing together? How do we want to work together? How does it actually feel to work here? And this is really important. The leader's job is no longer to have all of the answers, but to create that space where the conversations can happen and to leave enough room for someone to say something that doesn't feel right and for that to be treated as data rather than an inconvenience. And I think when I reflect on it, this is exactly the area where the work with the horses lies. And I want to tie this to something commercial rather than just leave this as an idea. Because remember, a horse cannot read your strategy. It has no interest in your job title, your track record, or indeed your carefully managed executive presence. A horse responds only to what is actually present in front of it, which means the gap between who a leader performs to be and who they actually are becomes visible within seconds. There is nowhere to hide, and there's no way to manage that message when you've got that incongruency between the two. And this reminds me of when I worked with Steve, who was the CEO of a company, and I asked him to go and catch a horse, and he went with no halter, no ropes. He had nothing to hold on to, and the horse just refused to be caught. And his whole leadership team were actually watching him at the time. And we actually had a discussion, and I learned that Steve often did this. He went off and did his own thing. But what's become really interesting is that now in the office, when Steve starts pushing too hard for the outcome without building the relationship, because that's the reason the horse run off, the team will say rather gently to him, Steve, you're having a cafe moment, because cafe was the name of that horse he couldn't catch. And this is some really honest feedback. It's delivered upwards to the chief executive without threat, without formal process. And I think this is the example of a true human-centric culture. It's where people can openly talk about what's happening in operational terms. And it, of course, only occurs when psychological safety is really at its highest level. So people feel empowered to give feedback without fear of ramifications for what they're saying. So trust, collaboration, and purpose stop being aspirations at level 3 and become operating conditions. And as a result of this, friction falls, decisions accelerate, and people stop protecting themselves. And this is precisely where this concept of teamship that I often talk about lives. Because teamship is not something people do, it's something a group becomes. And a group cannot become anything while the human beings inside of it are still being treated as replaceable components in a machine. So just think about that for a moment. Your teamship only really occurs when the group really recognizes that energy of working together, of everyone being valued on the team, and the team being in existence to make a difference in the world. So what is level 4? Level 4 culture is higher purpose culture. And if I'm truly honest, this is where probably a lot of you really hope you reside. But the reality is, from what I see from many businesses I work with, that isn't the case. And a higher purpose culture is when the organization is connected to something larger than its customers or its suppliers. It's connected to what is the difference the business wants to make in the world? And it's usually, this purpose is usually what we call a massive transformational purpose, something that's really going to make a difference. It's something that ignites and inspires our team members for something they want to go and strive to get. And because it's so transformational and so massive, it leaves so much space for people to come up with ideas. And this massive transformational purpose is giving us a railroad of where we can go and some tracks and boundaries of how to get there, whilst enabling all of the creativity along the way. When we create this, it means that our people aren't so overloaded. They've got some focus, they've got their direction, they've got that clarity. So their attention has somewhere to go and focus on. And let's just remember that AI can only draw on what already exists. It is by its nature a machine that looks backwards, however sophisticated some of the output that we receive is. But it can't originate. So in a world where every competitor of ours has access to the same models, trained on the same past data, the only really significant advantage and differentiator we have in the marketplace is our capacity to create something that's not existed before. And that capacity comes from being human. And it's fragile, but it actually needs the right conditions and environment that can create this, that enables the output of the culture to happen in a very systematic way and to thrive and flourish. So this brings me back to the herd. The horses have been navigating uncertainty and sustaining high performance for millions of years. And they've never done it through a command and control structure. They do it through this concept of shared leadership, collective awareness, and complete alignment behind the shared direction. The herd don't do teamwork, they practice teamship. And it operates at a level 4, not because it's enlightened, but because at level 1, it would already be extinct. When I look at the horse herd and the way the horse herd operates, it just isn't about a level 1 culture. It's about this level 4 culture, about the shared leadership, about it being one for all and all for one. And I think for many of us, this is exactly what our team members are looking for. They're looking to be part of something that's going to make a difference in the world, that they can put their head on, that they can make a contribution to, so that they can feel like they're making a difference in the world. Now, I think this is also really important for us to notice that the leader's job is not to live at level 4. Actually, the leader's job is to hold a balance across all different 4 types of culture. Because let's face it, work still has to be delivered. So level 1 isn't going to disappear. This output is never going to disappear. Judgment still has to be applied. So level 2 matters enormously. But the center of gravity in almost every organization I encounter is stuck at level 1. Because we've built a world, a legal system, and a set of market incentives that reward short-term output and punish almost everything else. And what does that mean? It means that the balance isn't going to correct itself, and it's not going to correct itself while everyone's busy. And this is why Simon Sinek talks about the infinite cycle. This is looking at the long-term gain within business so that everyone thrives in the long term. And I think it's really interesting that as a leader, we need to be able to learn how to read the energy of the room and notice when our team is not saying something that needs to be said or making decisions with incomplete data, when our team aren't paying attention. And I think it's really fascinating to me that in the wild, inattention is fatal. Because in my herd of horses, inattention could result in one of them being killed in the wild. But yet, in virtually every business I come across, inattention is rife and it's very expensive. And I always struggle to understand why we tolerate it for so long when the cost of being inattentive in business is fundamental. So we really need to remember that culture doesn't happen in the organizational chart. And as much as we keep saying culture descends from the top, and it does to some extent, I want to remind you of the statistic I opened with, that 70% of engagement variance sits with the direct manager, which means every middle manager in particular in your organization is running a culture right now, whether or not they know it, and whether or not it resembles the one that you have written on the wall and that you would like your business to have. So really important that we think about, are our middle managers on the same page about where we want the business to go? Because they are so fundamental in how the culture can shift in the business. So here's 3 things that I'd love you to consider doing. The first is stop assuming that living is enough. And what do I mean by that? When I ask leaders how they build the culture, almost everyone says that they want to model it, model the culture. But I want to suggest that is not sufficient. When people watch a leader simply living the values without ever speaking them, they cannot tell whether the given response is just transactional and whether the leader really believes it. And what does that do? That creates apprehension rather than clarity for people. So culture has to be systemically talked about and made very, very explicit. I like to think about culture as the rules of the game. And so it requires constant vigilant attention to make sure that the rules aren't being broken. And if they are being broken, it takes bravery and guts to say something and get everything back on track. Second suggestion, I would really encourage you to get your team members to write the rules. Like anything, when the culture is handed down from the senior leadership team, it arrives as an instruction, and nobody is ever inspired. So get your team out of the office, maybe come to one of my horse events, and ask them the question that nobody ever asks them, which is, what is the ideal way we could work together? That is a massive underused resource in your organization. Your team have all of the answers. And when we give our team members the opportunity to speak up and share ideas, they become more engaged, more motivated, more driven, because they want to make a difference in the world rather than being told what to do, which for people has exactly the opposite effect. And thirdly, I'd really encourage you to connect your culture to purpose rather than goals. So if we think about this, goals are really a mental construct. And if you tell your people they must hit such and such a number in profitability and they must trust each other, people will hear this kind of contradiction, right? They're always going to believe that the numbers, the profitability are going to be way more important to an organization than spending time building trust and building relationships with each other. But purpose is that thing that creates the pull, that helps everyone drive in the same direction. So you've got at the front the purpose creating the pull, and the goals create the push and helps everything move synergistically along. So when the purpose is actually really genuine, then the goals stop becoming a destination, but become the means and the way to move the business forward. We know that if we reach this goal, then that is on track, and that's a milestone for us reaching the purpose. And I just want to share with you one example of this and how important this is. And this is from my friend Lynette, who used to be the MD of a mining company in South Africa. And this is one of the most unionized industries out there. And you would imagine in a mining factory, it's very difficult to change the culture. But Lynette did just that in not just one of the units, but in all 6. And she did that by moving to a level 3 culture, by asking people what they needed, helping them see the bigger picture about how they contributed to the success of the company, and how they all could start pulling together to make a difference. And if they all did that, how that would have a massive transformational effect, not only on their wage check, but on the success of the business and how they feel about themselves. And so Lynette actually massively turned around that mining business simply by giving power and putting our people at the center of the business and creating this human-centered workforce. And so she was really adopting there that level 4 thinking, but in the first outset had to execute it within that level 1 environment. It wasn't rocket science, but it did need human science, and it needed a massive dose of courage for her to do that, because the easier thing for her to do was to stick to budget and do things as they'd always been done. But she knew that the way that they had currently been operating wasn't sustainable and something needed to change. And so putting people at the center of everything radically changed that whole business and turned it around. So my question to you as we draw this to a close is, if artificial intelligence, AI, is going to amplify whatever culture you're already running, exactly you're about to make more of, and if you're honest about your answer, is your leadership team currently organized around output, around intention, around the human, or around something larger? And would your team members, if you ask them, give you the same answer? Because the gap between these two answers is our leadership gap. And it's almost certainly costing you more than any line item in your P&L. So if you want to know where your team actually sits rather than where you believe they sit, I'd really encourage you to take the Turbocharge Your Team audit at businesshorsepower.com/quiz. It takes just a few minutes, and it's going to tell you which of these 4 culture zones your team is currently operating in. And then please do book a complimentary review with me, and we'll look at the results together. So I hope you found this episode interesting. I've certainly found it fascinating, and I really can see now the challenges that so many organizations have with operating at culture level 1. And I'm really thankful to Peter Matthies and the Conscious Business Institute for giving me a language to help me explain to you about these 4 levels of culture and how it works. So until next time, have an amazing week. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the Impactful Teamwork Podcast. Please stay tuned for future episodes and do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating on your favorite platform. Recommendations are essential for attracting new listeners. Please follow us on social media at Julia Felton and at Business Horsepower. And if there are any topics you'd like us to cover on future episodes, please do let me know. Remember, you and your team are always making an impact. What impact will you make today?